Welcome to the Christian Business Concepts with your host, Harold Milby. Christian Business Concepts is dedicated to guiding companies and business owners in becoming effective, efficient, and successful through God's Word and godly principles. Now, here's your host, Harold Milby.
Hey, welcome today to another Christian Business Concepts podcast. I'm really excited to be coming to you today and talking about this specific subject. I'm Harold Milby, your host. And today we're going to be talking about when to coach and when to manage. If you want to be a successful business person, if you want to be a successful business owner or a successful Christian leader, whether it be a pastor or a Christian leader in another capacity, if you want to be successful, you need to have a clear understanding of coaching versus managing. They are completely different, and I want to talk about that today. You know, over the last 15 or 20 years, businesses have placed an emphasis on management learning to coach their subordinates instead of managing them. You know, the thought behind this, seems to be the desire for businesses to grow and develop their employees, and that it takes coaching to get that done. But like many other new business teachings and philosophies, they're adopted at the expense of other teachings and philosophies that are being just thrown to the roadside. You know, in business, one of the most important goals is profit. So the desire to reach this profitability sometimes overrides common sense. You know, in business, there's always been a challenge to strike a balance between quality and cost. You know, we all want to make and purchase quality products. We get that. But if the cost to make such a product is so high that the consumer cannot recognize the value proposition of the item being sold, then the business venture will not survive. Thus, there needs to be a balance between quality and cost. You know, this needs to be a balance, or there should be a balance struck also in governments. Take, for example, the current struggle in the United States to have a balance between freedom and security. The federal government has a responsibility to protect its citizens from attacks from within and without, but at what cost? What freedoms are we willing to give up in order to have this protection and security? So coaching and managing should be looked at from the same perspective. It should be looked at with balance. If you find that you're more of a coach, then you need to learn how to be a better manager. If you're a gifted manager, then you need to learn how to become a better coach. Both coaching and management are needed to be successful as a leader and as someone who is a boss or manager of other people. You know, consider it this way. Look at it this way. If you were in a boat out in a lake and all you were given was one oar, and you're trying to reach the other side of a lake, and I think you'll quickly get that image that if you've only got one oar, you're destined to just go around in circles. In order to reach your destination, you have to have both oars working together in harmony and in balance. In order to reach your destination, in order to reach your goals in your business or your organization, you need to have a balance of coaching and managing. You know, managing is more about directing people, and coaching is more about developing people. Let me say that again. Managing is more about directing people, and coaching is more about developing people. Jesus was not as worried about success as he was about transformation. And so as we think about coaching, we think about the transformation of people, the development of people. But first, let's kind of talk a little bit about management. If you want to look in Mark chapter 11, verses 2 and 3, the Bible says, and it says that, and he saith unto them, Go your way into the village over against you, and as soon as you be entered into it, you shall find a colt tied, whereon never man sat. Loose him and bring him. And if any man say unto you, why do you do this? Say ye that the Lord has need of him, and straightway he will send him hither. Now this is Jesus speaking to his disciples as a manager. He wasn't trying to coach them in this particular passage. He was managing them. Here's what needs to be done. I need you to go get it done. Quite simple, very straightforward, very frank. In Mark chapter 14, in verses 13 through 15, it says, And he sendeth forth two of his disciples, and said unto them, Go you into the city, and there you shall meet a man bearing a pitcher of water. Follow him. And wheresoever he goes in, say you to the goodman of the house, the master says, Where is the guest chamber where I shall eat the Passover with my disciples? And he will show you a large upper room furnished and prepared. There make ready for us. Again, this is an example of management. He's not trying to coach them. He does that through a lot of the parables that we read in the Bible. He's trying to transform the listener through the parable that he's sharing. But in this case, he's managing the disciples. Here's a biblical example of coaching. In 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 1 through 7. So Nathan is trying to help David because David had committed a heinous sin when he had slept with one of his soldiers' wives while he was at war, and she became pregnant. And now he had to try to cover it up. And so when he came in from the battlefield, he refused to lay with his wife, even though David said, no, you should go ahead and be with your wife, spend time with her. But he wouldn't do it because of the integrity that Nathan or that this man had. So what David did was he sent him to the front of the battle, knowing that if he was in the front of the battle, he'd be killed. And so David had committed the sin, and so this is where 2 Samuel 12, verse 1 through 7 comes in. And the Lord sent Nathan unto David, and he came unto him and said unto him, There were two men in one city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had exceeding many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing, save one little ewe lamb, which he had bought and nourished up. And it grew up together with him and with his children, and it did eat of his own meat, and drank of his own cup, and lay in his bosom, and was unto him as a daughter. And there came a traveler unto the rich man, and he spared to take of his own flock and of his own herd to dress for the wayfaring man that was come into him, but took the poor man's lamb, and dressed it for the man that was come to him. And David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, As the Lord liveth, the man that has done this thing shall surely die. And he shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing, because he had no pity. And Nathan said to David, Thou art the man. So what happened was that Nathan here was trying to coach David. And I think you can see the difference. He was trying to help David see his sin. He was trying to help him understand what he had done. In fact, a lot of what coaching does, it's about discovery. Discovering yourself, discovering your motives, discovering why, discovering these things about you. That's kind of what the difference is. And really a great example between managing and coaching is seen in the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament was about compliance. There were all these laws that the Jews had to live up to, and so that was all about compliance. They had to comply with the Old Testament. They had to comply with the laws that God had established for the Jewish nation. It was all about compliance. And that's really what management's about. It's about compliance. This is what I need done. I need you to do it. Get it done. That's compliance. But coaching is more like the New Testament. And in the New Testament, we see that it's about transformation. It's not really about compliance. It's about transforming, becoming a person that understands how much the Lord loves us, that he gave his life for us, that his blood was shed on Calvary for us. So it really is more about transformation and not compliance. You know, we're saved by grace through faith, not of works, lest any man should boast, according to the Word of God. So the Old Testament was more about compliance. and the New Testament is more about transformation. So it really is a good example of the difference between management and coaching. So let's kind of look at some differences between managing and coaching, right? So managing tells, they tell people what to do. It's a very straightforward communication. Coaching asks. So it's going to ask questions. It's going to try to dig in a little deeper. Managing is focused on the task, whereas coaching is focused on the employee. Managing is compliant, whereas coaching is collaborative. Managing is about policies, whereas coaching is about potential. Managing is about directing, whereas coaching is about teaching. Managing is about expectations, while coaching is more about inspiration. Managing is about aptitude, whereas coaching is about attitude. And then lastly, managing is about directives, whereas coaching is about development. So I'm hoping that you really get an understanding here of the differences between, coaching and managing. Because it's important to know when to manage and when to coach if you're ever going to be an effective boss and an effective leader. There are times when it's completely inappropriate to coach an employee. In fact, certain situations demand more managing and directing. That happens. It happens all day, throughout the day, with every company, within every company. So you say, Harold, when do you manage versus when do you coach? Well, let's just look at when do you manage. You need to manage when there's a crisis. A crisis is not the time to allow employees to make decisions on their own and what steps need to be taken. Not during a crisis. You need to manage that. You need to tell them, here's where you're going to go. This is a time for the boss to be clear in their direction. This is the time they're going to need, you, the boss, is going to need to take more control. I'm sure if you were a student pilot and you're flying at 10,000 feet, you would want the instructor to take over if there was some kind of an emergency, right? Or if there was a serious issue with the plane's instruments. In fact, I would think you would feel relieved knowing that the instructor was always in the cockpit with you when you're learning to fly. It gives you a sense of security, right? So the same thing can be said for employees. They have a sense of security knowing the boss can and will take the controls if anything goes wrong. So during a crisis is when you want to manage. Also, you want to manage when the employee is inexperienced. Until an employee has received proper training, you're going to need to exercise more control over the specific ways their work and their tasks are completed. These employees, they need you to give them very detailed instructions. So whenever I have a new hire as a regional sales manager, I give them very specific parameters with regard to pricing and discounts. All the pricing agreements and discount agreements must be approved by me personally and discussed in detail. After several months of having these types of discussions, I start giving them, a little bit more freedom to make those calls, to make those decisions, because they know my heart, they know what I would do. So they don't really necessarily have to come to me with the approvals as they learn. But in the beginning, I'm managing them because they don't have the experience. They know that even if they make a bad agreement in the end, after they've kind of learned me, they'll know that even if they make a bad decision, I'll support them and I'll use it as a teaching moment. I wouldn't do what you just did and I'll just use that as a teaching moment. My desire is that I don't want to stifle the initiative that they took. My goal is to help them develop their skill and understanding of what constitutes a good agreement. That's what I'm trying to do. But in the beginning, they're inexperienced. Absolutely, I'm going to manage. Another time when you want to manage is when an employee has a lack of confidence. And sometimes a lack of confidence comes from not having received the amount of training that was needed to get that task done. Maybe they didn't get enough training. Some people will have a lack of confidence based upon past failures, whether it be in their personal life that they've carried over into their work life. That happens. And until you've coached them beyond this manage them beyond this past experience, they're going to need you to tell them what specific needs are in front of them that they need to accomplish. So you've got to manage them at that point. You got to manage when there are new directives and policies and procedures. My boss told me one time when I first came into management, he sat me down in his office and he said, look, I just want to tell you, anytime that I'm talking about doing something, you have an absolute obligation and you have freedom to come to me and tell me why you think it's going to be a bad choice and a bad decision. But once I make that decision, I expect you to get in the car, shut the door, keep your mouth shut while we drive down the road. So, what he was saying was I have an opportunity to say things to him when I think that the decision hasn't been made yet. So he'll take my advice or he'll look at it or he'll try to look at it from my perspective. But once that decision has been made, once there are new directives, once there's new policies and procedures, this isn't about coaching them through that. This is about managing them. These are the times when you just simply tell your employees what specifically needs to be done. There's no discussion. This is not time for collaboration. This is the time for action. This is when the task is more important than the development of the employee. So now here's a couple of additional thoughts on managing employees, and I hope that these help you. First of all, you got to use different gears. One of the things, again, that my former employer told me, or former boss that owned the company told me, he said, Harold, you're a great coach. You really are. He said, I watch you with the employees. He said, I wish I was more of a coach like you are. But he said, you need to be a manager too. He said, and there's times when you guys got to change gears in order to bring that truck up to speed. Some employees and some events will require you to use different quote unquote gears, if I could say it that way, because you've got a specific task that needs to get done. You've got to change gears. There are times that you can coach that employee, you can work with them, you can take your time with them, let them stumble, let them make a few mistakes. But then there are times you got to kick it up a notch, and you've got to just get firm, and you can't back down. You can't be wimpy about it, And an employee, for example, who's made the same mistake multiple times, they're going to need to be dealt with somewhat more intensity than if it was the first time that he made the mistake, right? So you're going to need, or you're going to find that some employees respond better when you deal with them in a very straightforward and direct and intense manner. I used to have an employee like that. I couldn't get him to do anything unless I just got in his face over it. And one time we finally talked about it. He said, that's the way that I like to work. I want you to come to me like that. That's how, that's what motivates me. So anything less than this approach doesn't really seem to get their attention. So some of those people are like that. You have to know who those employees are. But just remember, sometimes in managing people, you've got to use different gears, right? The next thing is make sure that even when you're managing people, that you let respect rule. When you're required to tell or instruct an employee on what to do, you should always do so with respect. I've seen bosses destroy morale in departments and in entire companies because of the lack of respect that they show towards their staff and their employees. And nothing shows respect more than using good manners and being polite when dealing with others. Now, some people say, well, that's not who I am. That's not the way I am. People know how I am, and they just take it or leave it. Well, that's just a poor excuse for saying that you're not willing to change or you're not willing to try to do better. Employees don't respond very well to intense communication or yelling or screaming. Nobody likes that. Most people will tell you they don't respond well to it. They tighten up. They're afraid they're going to make a mistake and then have their head handed to them. I mean, it's just not a good way to manage. You've got to let respect rule. That is key to managing people. I used to have a boss that always wanted to have people to be honest and upfront with them, but nobody was. And he was the only one that didn't know it. They all told him what they thought they wanted him to hear, because he had the personality that even if he asked for your opinion and your opinion was different than his passion about what he thought came across as being angry and very, what's the word I'm looking for? Very aggressive towards the person that he's talking to. Well, nobody likes that. I can remember one time in a meeting, we had something going on. We were talking, and we had salespeople there. We had factory management people, production people there. And we had this conversation in this large conference room, and I remember that the owner got really passionate about something we were discussing. And I've been working for this guy for a long time. Most of the people in the room had as well. And so while we were having that conversation, what we didn't know was that there were some employees in the office that were listening, because their desk and everything was in pretty close proximity to the conference room, so they could hear everything being said. So we took a break, and there were some people standing outside smoking a cigarette, and I don't smoke cigarettes, but I happened to be out there talking to some people. And a couple of the women came out, and one of them was in tears, literally. And she said, "I'm so sorry that you guys are having to deal with that." And we all kind of looked at her and we said, "Well, what are you talking about?" "Well, I could hear him yelling at everybody." And I said, "Oh, no. That's when he gets passionate, that's kind of the way he comes across." The problem is he was never really sensitive to that about himself. And it finally came to a head one day, and we were having lunch, and he said, "Do you think people are honest with me when they talk to me?" And I leaned back in my chair and I said, "No, absolutely not. They're not." "Well, why?" he asked. I said, "Because they're always afraid you're going to cut their head off every time that they say something that you don't agree with." And he sat back and he looked at me and he said, "I can see that. I can see that about myself, and I'd like for you to help me with it." So I did my best to help him through it the remaining years that he owned the company. But again, it doesn't show respect to the person that you're working with. Management is a very specific tool that's used when you need to get something done quickly, when you need to get something done specifically, and when you need to get something done that's in a time frame that you have that's staring you in the face. You've got a deadline that you've got to get done. Now, I always go back to this when you communicate with somebody. It's not so much about what you say, it's how you say it. It's when you're managing people and you're telling them something or you're requiring them to do something, you don't have to look at them and just bark out orders. You don't have to act like a drill sergeant in the Marine Corps. But you can be very straightforward and very frank with people and let them know that, this is what needs to be done, but you can still be very respectful. Now, the other thing I want to let you know is to keep in mind your personality type. I have that personality type that when I get forceful, when I become very direct, people can tend to become offended at the way that I talk to them. I've even had people go to others and say, "Well, he yelled at me." Never raised my voice. But because it was so out of my normal personality, out of my normal nature, and the way that I deal with people, they took it very personally. And unfortunately, that's not the way I meant it. So over the years, I've had to learn that and recognize that my personality also has an effect on how people receive what I'm saying. And so you need to recognize that as well. If you're not that type of person normally, and then you go to a person and you kind of bark out some commands, they're going to be offended at that because that's not your normal personality. Now, I know people they're a little bit gruff or maybe they're just always very straightforward. They're almost always task-orientated, whereas I'm people-oriented. And I think that's a big part of it. You're either task-oriented or people-oriented. The people who are people-oriented tend to struggle more when they have to give directives in a very straightforward way because they're so people-oriented that it causes them to look a lot worse than what it is because that's just not what people are used to. So what I would encourage you to really think about that and to work on those management techniques because you're going to need to manage and coach. So listen, that's the totality of what I wanted to talk about with regards to management. On the next broadcast, I want to talk about coaching. So we're talking about managing versus coaching and when you do which. And so I thank you for tuning in to this week's broadcast and look forward to sharing with you on the next broadcast of the Christian Business Concepts podcast. Thanks. Have a great day. And just realize that Jesus is Lord and Jesus does want you and your business blessed.
Thank you for tuning into this week's Christian Business Concepts podcast. Go to ChristianBusinessConcepts.com for more information and resources. Be sure to check out other podcasts that will help you take your business and your personal life to a whole new level of success.